Humanists. Our speaker today is Paul Entwistle. Paul is well known to us as he's been a member of Dorset Humanists, I think, for at least 15 years or thereabouts.
Must be.
And this is Paul's second talk for us. The last one last year was on proportional representation, which you may have heard. Today he's going to try and help us unravel the problem of the housing crisis. So do please give Paul a very warm welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Seems like the sound's about right. Is that okay? Thank you, David. I've got a fairly long preamble, and then we'll get to the main presentation. But before I start, I just want to make one statement, because most of what I will say today is in favour of housing our less advantaged and our young. Now, I know that in general, none of us want to build over England's green and pleasant land, but as a society I think we have a duty to do that. So that's where I'm coming from, and I don't mention green aspects very much. So many of us know a good deal about this topic because of our personal experiences. I imagine that a few of you have worked in the sector, so you may well know more than I do, and if so, I hope you will speak up during the Q&A. In passing, I was going to introduce 4 books. Let's try this out. Lo and behold, which I found useful, each giving a different slant on the subject. Rather than go through them now, if they may be of interest, do please feel free to come and check them out after the talk. Meanwhile, I'd just like to read out 3 extracts from the book. They're all very short, which will help set the scene. The first one's from the Book of Trespass by Nick Hayes, subtitled Crossing the Lines That Divide Us. The vast majority of our country is entirely unknown to us because we are banned from setting foot in it. By law of trespass, we are excluded from 92% of the land and 97% of its waterways, blocked by walls whose legitimacy is rarely questioned. But behind them lies a story of enclosure, exploitation, and dispossession of public rights whose effects last to this day. So you get the drift of what he's talking about. The other 2 are from a book by Guy Shrubsole called Who Owns England, subtitled How We Lost Our Land and How to Take It Back. And the first one is a quote from Winston Churchill, which seems quite an unlikely one given his point of view. Land is by far the greatest of monopolies, raged Churchill, in a blistering polemic penned in 1909. Consider, he wrote, the enrichment which comes to the landlord who happens to own a plot of land on the outskirts or in the centre of one of our great cities. The landowner need only wait while other people work and pay taxes to make the city grow more prosperous, building businesses, installing roads and railways, paying for schools and hospitals and public amenities. All the while, Churchill growled, the land monopolist has only to sit still and complacently watch his property multiplying in value, sometimes manifold, without either effort or contribution on his part. And that is justice. We'll discuss whether it's justice as we go. And then a short quote from Shrubsole himself. Uncovering the extraordinary story of how England has come to be owned by so few has at times made my blood boil. I hope it does the same for you too. But I also hope that it inspires you to take action to make things better. In an old conservative country like England, it can often feel like things never change. But the example of successful land reform programs in other countries, such as Scotland, should give us hope, as should our own forgotten history of land reform movements. Get land reform right, and we can go a long way towards ending the housing crisis, restoring nature, and making our society more equal. You probably know that roughly 2/3 of people have an interest in property, that is, they have houses to a greater or lesser degree which they own, and about 1/3 do not. And the latter, of course, are the main losers in our story today. A secure home is essential for a productive and a flourishing life, and we deny that possibility to far too many, as we shall see. But the rest of us have all been misused as well, as we shall also see. So I have a few points to manage your expectations. Firstly, this talk is going to be political. It could not be otherwise. The situation we are in is a direct consequence of institutions and policies, or absence of policies, caused directly by government. We must recognise this. Information. There's a huge amount of data in and around this subject, as you might imagine. It is easy to get bogged down on details, and often comparable numbers appear to conflict, though that is often explained by different timescales and whether we happen to be talking about the UK or the whole United Kingdom. I have tried to focus on trends and order of magnitude figures to paint a picture rather than spending too much time on precision. In particular, averages and countrywide figures can be very misleading, so we must bear in mind that the position in Scotland or Northern Ireland is very different from London, and the challenges each region faces will vary too. All right, I'll skip that one. So where are we now? Articles relating to some aspects of housing appear every day in the press. And indeed, there was an interesting one this morning in the Times, which Barry Newman very kindly tipped me off for, so that should save my blushes later on. I have selected a few topics which are likely to be front of mind before we start. Rather than read them out, you might just wish to scan the 2 slides. I'll give you a few moments. We'll consider all of these in more detail, though you may have to decide for yourselves whether landlords are wicked or not. I will say, though, that neither main political party has a housing objective in their existing 5-point plans. Today's objectives. I'll start with a few key themes which help explain or underlie most of our concerns. We will then look at some history. It is no accident we are where we are. Liam Halligan has a chapter outlining the current situation in a dozen graphs. I have juggled these a bit to see them as current trends, and they help us judge whether our initial perceptions from the earlier slides are sound. So far as winners and losers are concerned, they may seem obvious, but I think there will be some interesting aspects to raise. And in passing, we look at 1 or 2 other important areas such as taxation. So, 2 key themes. The first one is the power of landowners, a relatively small number in the UK. To illustrate this, there was a famous Duke of Westminster quote on being asked if he had any advice to encourage the younger generation in emulating his success. "Why, yes," he said, "make sure they have an ancestor who was a very close friend of William the Conqueror." Most land in ownership in Great Britain was taken with no recognisable merit or justice in today's terms. Why do they have such power? And should they indeed retain it? Though I'm not going to be suggesting revolution. Just to give you an idea of Lord Grosvenor's wealth, that's the alternative name of the Duke of Westminster. Some years ago, I drew a graph of wealth with a scale of £1 million to 1 inch. On that scale, the Duke of Westminster's 10 billion would be just under the height of the Shard in London. 1 inch, height of the Shard. He did not fit on my graph. And as he frankly acknowledges, his wealth derives from who came over on boats in 1066.
That's crazy.
Second big theme, land prices. You probably recognise that picture, most of you, and you may well know that a plot changed hands in Sandbanks recently for just over £13 million. Land, of course, is the largest asset of the UK's national wealth. It is a vital factor of production even in the age of the computer. High land prices seep into every aspect of our economic and social activities and make our pubs and gyms and car parks more expensive. This slide refers to the recent purchase of a plot in Sandbanks. The land includes a modest-sized bungalow, which I don't think we can see, but I suspect it's on the left of the picture, whose life expectancy is now very low indeed. This example highlights one very important issue, which is the proportion of land value in British property prices. In this example, the building cost of the bungalow cannot be more than a few £100,000, if that. So we see that the land proportion of this property is way above 95%. Now that is of course exceptional, but the proportions commonly accepted in England are between about 67 and 70%. Meaning that on average over 2/3 of property prices are the land plots. This percentage will of course vary considerably across the country. So the takeaway is most of our discussion is about land and not the buildings themselves. Next big theme, insane house prices. Referring to this slide, Professor Danny Dorling of Oxford University states that Britain's extractive model of housing is out of step with many of our European neighbours. In his book, Shattered Nation, he points out that had house prices only risen in line with consumer inflation over the last 70 years, the average home last year would have cost about £63,000. Or just around twice the median full-time UK salary. That's in contrast to an average house price of, I think, about £275,000 or thereabouts. Obviously in the south they creep up a lot more than that. Professor Dorling says money is siphoned from the less well-off to the already wealthy when tenants pay excessive rents, when they buy an overpriced house, and even when they keep up with their large mortgage payments. I gather that about 115 MPs are buy-to-let landlords. It wouldn't surprise me if it was more than that. And many have 2 or more houses. Sadly, they do not seem collectively to see the problem, although a lot of individual MPs do, of course. Now, it must be said that if the average price of a house was only 63,000, we would have a completely different economy, although I claim it would be better in many ways. But the example shows the extent of what we have lost, and this money extraction model, which Dorling outlines, must surely be one reason for our sluggish economic growth. Planning gain, I don't know if that's a familiar term for most of you. It's alternatively called betterment or land value capture, LVC. And it is the increase in value of land when planning permission is granted. Now, if you have agricultural land and planning permission is granted, often with the help of a developer, then the value of that land multiplies by between 1 and 200 times. So for example, your £10,000 acre would be selling for, let's say, £1 million or over. And in fact, Halligan's quoted example is 275 times, but maybe that's exceptional, I don't know. Profits from this normally go to the landowners and developers. Now, there is modest tax and recovery for joint costs by councils for infrastructure and so on, but we'll see that this is completely inadequate in due course. To judge the extent of this, about 18 billion changed hands in 2016-17, less about 5 billion estimated for tax and recovery. I'd be surprised, to be honest, if it's that much, because there are lots of ways of avoiding the tax. That's a great deal of money going to a relatively small number of people. And we will see the history of that and the consequences as we go. And if you'll excuse me, I'm just going to have a sip of water. I've deliberately chosen a provocative title here, but it seems that William the Conqueror managed to do what Hitler could not. The point is that when William the Conqueror took over in 1066, as you know, he had the Domesday Book prepared and set the template for land ownership for the next 1,000 years, although obviously it's changed hands a few times. Reflect for a moment. Landowners provided virtually all parliamentarians until 1900, and thereafter have been intricately entwined with the Conservatives, who are the default party of government. There are a few points to highlight here. I've given a fairly generous period attributable to enclosure of the commons. I don't know that they went on till 1900, but 200 or 300 years probably in England. So you'll be aware of the land enclosures, which boil down to landowners with or without support of the law, progressively taking over the bulk of the common land in England, and even more ruthlessly in Scotland and Ireland, but that is beyond our brief. Commoners were left to fend for themselves or join the heartless industrialisation process. Let us emphasise in passing that many landowners today can trace their heritage back to important historical events in the past, anything from 1066 to the Civil War. And some of them, of course, are still MPs. The pattern of ownership was set by conquest, theft of land, slavery, and colonial and industrial proceeds most ruthlessly acquired. We might bear this heritage in mind when we're considering future policy. Moving on to 1873, return of owners of land. The first formal review of land holdings since the Domesday Book was undertaken. The results apparently caused considerable embarrassment to the government when it was seen that about 4,000 of the landed elite owned half the country. Estimates of this kind are very hard because of poor available data, but Guy Shrubsole thinks this number is still about right as a proportion of the private land held, although of course other institutions hold land too. As we see from the slide, our modern planning system was only introduced as late as 1947. In 1980, the Thatcher government introduced right-to-buy policies, under which social houses were sold off to tenants at well below cost. Home ownership peaked at about 71% in 2003. The proportion of ownership has since fallen by several percent due to progressive austerity and financial constraints. Let's look at the last century a bit more closely, perhaps a bit more relevant to today. Britain, of course, was essentially broke after both world wars, but maintained startling rates of house building in both cases afterwards, and achieved far more than we manage in the 21st century. Now, some of them were prefabs and some of them weren't very pretty, but that's perhaps another issue. Lloyd George's government took control of national planning for the first time in 1919. The policy was to provide homes for heroes, for gratitude, morality, and to promote political stability. Government subsidies encouraged council houses available more or less to all. Further, mostly Labour initiatives led to slum clearance and more subsidies. Mass production of decent low-cost accommodation followed, with nearly 300,000 units per annum in 1932 and 1933, to provide for a far smaller population than we have today. We might reasonably look upon that number as a target, as indeed the current government did up until yesterday. By 1939, 10% of the population were now in social housing, from a much lower number previously. World War II saw 500,000 houses destroyed, but a major build and replacement programme took place even though the country was broke and suffered shortages. We might conclude that there was more political will in those days. In 1946, the New Towns Act provided for the purchase of large acreages and set up development corporations. From 1947, planning permission in its current form was introduced. In particular, land was purchased at existing use price, that is, normally agricultural price, and all betterment accrued to the state. This enabled local authorities to fund local infrastructure, such as schools, roads and shops. Note in passing that Britain's current spend on local infrastructure is no longer adequately funded, and we are way behind other comparable countries. This is, of course, a major dissatisfaction for potential NIMBYs, who can very fairly point to overloading of existing services when new houses are built. So in the 1950s, landowners and obviously the Conservatives opposed this situation, and laws were progressively changed, culminating in the Land Compensation Act 1961. This provided that all land purchases, all compulsory land purchases by the state, should be at open market value, or what is often called hope value, which specifically allows for and includes aspirational planning gain. And that has left to the consequence I was talking about earlier, where your agricultural land at 10,000 can now be sold for $1 million and upwards. In my opinion, this act is arguably the worst economic blow to British living standards since World War II, set perhaps against some pretty startling recent opposition. Let's look at the contrast between the success of interwar development and the consequences of this horrendous act. So, housing between the wars, in spite of the Great Depression, in general there was cheap money, just as there has been in the last 15 years or so. More mortgage finance was becoming available with the maturity of building societies. Land was cheap and available, which led to relatively low densities of housing. Commuter services were being extended into suburbia and famously Metroland, north and west of London. There were few planning laws, but in spite of that, a lot of the builders and developers seemed to have done a pretty good job. There were a lot of small and medium enterprises, so there was healthy competition, and there was funding for new infrastructure from the land value capture. Now, the reason I've gone through this in great detail is because it gives some pointers as to perhaps what we might like to have for the future, starting from today. Moving past World War II, we can see that the passion for housing was across all parties. Here is the Macmillan Conservative Manifesto from 1951, and I think he deserves credit for this. Housing is the first of social services. It is also one of the keys to increased productivity. Work, family life, health and education are all undermined by crowded houses. Therefore, a Conservative and Unionist government will give housing a priority second only to national defence. And the three words at the bottom, how times change, are mine, not Macmillan's. Current governments pay lip service to a similar aspiration but fail to plan it and carry it out. So, the Land Compensation Act, the Wicked Witch of the East, the Darth Vader, the real bad guy. So to remind you, owners and developers now get hope value. So there's very high value attached to development land. That led to rampant speculation, land prices soared. Housing now had to be high density, so social housing had to move upwards, which is why we get a lot of tower blocks in the 60s and 70s, which were not always a great success, as you may know. Completions plummeted. Demand started to exceed supply, and supply has never caught up since. The right to buy from 1980 onwards exacerbated this situation by taking social housing out of the available formula, and local authority provision had disappeared by 1993. So provision of houses by local councils has been virtually extinguished by this act and various government policies. I've got two examples to illustrate the scale of what has occurred. The first one's from Panorama, which you may have seen on the 27th of March, a couple of weeks ago. Here the example was a particular council house in a row of 4, which were owned by one landlord, originally sold right to buy to the tenant for £15,000, obviously many years ago. It's now changed into 6 rather small and ugly bed sits, which raises the landlord £60,000 per annum. He's a very fortunate man because he owns 4 adjacent properties, so we can presume he's earning about £250,000 a year from this outlay. That would probably be worth more than the 4 units concerned would cost to build. All this lot, or most of it at least, is probably paid by housing benefit, so that's courtesy of everybody here. At least 40%, and I've heard 50% plus, right to buy council homes are now owned by private landlords who tend to charge over twice social rents. And this is obviously a catalogue of catastrophe for tenants, with people paying more for worse conditions. This is not to say, of course, the right to buy didn't sound like quite a good idea when it started off, which was giving people the opportunity to own their own homes for a relatively reasonable price. But I think it was perfectly foreseeable that a lot of them would take a few bucks, sell it on, and here we are. Let's see if I can find out where I'm supposed to be reading from. No, not a chance. Oh well, I'll bluff it out. Farm purchase example, and again this is in the past, so the values which are illustrative only, they'd be much higher. This is about relatives of an acquaintance I have, and her relations were tenant farmers in the 1950s in what became the M3 corridor. It was a pretty lucky place to have a farm. They bought land back in the early 50s for £5,000. I have to tell you, agricultural land was a lot cheaper in those days, and I think they got quite a healthy discount as well. They sold not all of it in 2 tranches in the early 2000s for £6 million and £20 million. If it was today's prices, it would be considerably more than that. And they reinvested in other land to defer paying CGT indefinitely, capital gains tax. So they may be very nice people, and they're probably very good farmers, but they acquired enormous wealth for adding no added value to society themselves. And obviously there's some inflation in this example, but it's not material. So is this meritocracy as we would like to see it? Is this capitalism as we would like to see it? And I would just add, why does it matter? Because excess reward drives inequality, and it's built into everything we do. I'm now really going to have to find out where I am on the slides. Please bear with me. Okay, we will now romp through 9 trends from recent years and then see who the winners and the losers are in the game as she is now played. In 1980, when Right to Buy came in, courtesy of Mrs. Thatcher, the house price to earnings ratio was 4.4. That is, on average, whatever you earned, you needed 4.4 times that to buy a house. By 2018, it was about 7.5, and it's now between 8 and 9. With a mortgage limit of 4 times earnings, we can see why housing for the young has fallen away, and we'll see some stats on that. Obviously, those numbers vary by region. In London, it's reckoned about 12 times. Wales and Northern Ireland, probably more accessible at about 5 times. So we now live in a world where the normal rules of capitalism do not apply. The high price of a product should lead to more supply. This is basic economics. But the market is both rigged and distorted. SMEs, small and medium enterprises, have progressively been shut out of the market, partly because higher land prices need higher funding. And, of course, the financial crisis of 2008 and 9 wiped out many SMEs. Now, there are a few gloomy faces out there. I wish I could tell you a happier story, but I'm afraid most of this is probably what is happening and has happened. Meanwhile, rising prices mean that large builders make profits just sitting on land, so they don't particularly care whether they develop it now or 5 years down the track. And the lack of true competition and the power imbalance between developers and councils encourage cherry picking from a portfolio of permits. So it's good to have quite a few planning permits in your back pocket, and then you complete and release according to where you think you'll do best. Theme 2, the private rented sector. I appreciate many of you will know this, but I thought it's worth still writing a few of these things down on paper. It's obviously flourished greatly under the Conservatives. There have been enormous tax incentives, but they're now somewhat reduced, and great returns, partly because, or largely because of the capital gains that buy-to-let landlords have had. As a provision, that's gone from 2.1 million in 1991 to 4.7 million units today, although there's been a recent setback in this area because a lot of people who bought buy-to-let houses or flats with very low interest rates have suddenly discovered that in the last year or so they're having trouble funding their mortgages, so they're selling them. Now, that's trumpeted as a bit of a catastrophe. I have my doubts because, of course, those houses are still occupied. They have been sold to somebody. But from the point of view of the humble renter, options are now even fewer. David, do you think it might be an idea to give people just 1 or 2 minutes to sort of reboot their brains? Because I'm conscious we've got a lot of information here going in. We're quite tight on time, but would you just like a short rest to digest the terrible messages that are coming across?
Do you want to take 1 or 2 questions now?
We could take a couple, yes. Yes, I will struggle to finish by 3, or indeed quarter past.
That's okay, we've got until past. Kathy?
Just about what you said about the house prices increasing compared with income.
Yes, indeed.
It's a couple of slides, yes. Are you talking about the mode, the medium, or the mean? Because I think that everybody covers up the fact by saying median is 31,000. If you look at the average wage of what the mode people earn down here, it's probably about 22,000 to 23,000, which completely changes that.
It does indeed, and I accept the point, and that was partly why I raised the proviso at the beginning, because a lot of these statistics are somewhat misleading, but the main point emerging here is that what was affordable has become unaffordable for people at the bottom end of the market. So I accept your point, yes, and my guess is it's based on median, but I can't be sure.
Phil?
I had another query, Paul. Earlier on, what your slide said that there was an estimate that if house prices had only gone up in line with consumer inflation, they'd be about 60,000.
Yeah.
But that's way less than the rebuilding costs of a house now. So, I mean, even accepting that the rebuilding cost is much less than the purchase cost of a house.
Yes, that was why.
3 or something.
That was why I qualified my answer in saying that we would have had a completely different economy. Now, I don't know off the top of my head whether building costs in that period have gone up faster than consumer price inflation. I rather suspect that they have, but I can't be sure. Again, I take your point. I mean, I think Professor Dorling probably chose a pretty favourable starting point for his comparison. But the main theme of the slide is that house prices have gone up many, many times faster than consumer inflation, and that has obvious consequences. And those high prices feed into everything. I mean, they probably feed into the rent for this room, although I don't think that's usurious at all.
It doesn't just mean that the builders have got a lot richer than the average.
Well, in certain places they have. I mean, my son lives in Windsor, and he lives in a row of sort of 2 up, 2 downs, all the opposite of detached. and they've all got extensions and raised bits and so on tacked on the back. Now they're all paying for those relatively small additions rather less than you probably pay for a new house in Doncaster or Stirling, you know. So yes, it's a bit of a nightmare figuring out a single statistic to summarise all this.
That 1980 figure is distorted because the right to buy, there were many, many council houses sold for a fraction of their value, so therefore 4.4 isn't the true figure really.
No, the slide then is misleading. I was not meaning to imply that that was the case for people buying off council houses, but the market situation.
Yeah, but they're part of the market.
They are part of the market, yes.
And therefore it's a distorted figure. If those houses had been sold at the current price, that 4.4 would probably be 6.4.
Well, I have it in my mind that for most of my early years as an adult, the multiple that was normally used was between 3 and 3.5. So statistically, I think you have a point. I'd be very surprised if that number took into account the low value council purchases. Plus, I don't think they all happened at once in 1 year. I don't know the answer to your question.
We'll take one more and then we'll let you carry on. Yeah, Eric.
Thank you. It's very simplistic to say it's not a housing crisis, it's a population crisis. That's a simple way of saying it. But as we know, there's a number of people coming into the country. But there's also an expectation crisis. In my lifetime, I know I've expected more and more. Better housing, better this, better that, better the other. It's part of the individual desire. And I've lived at different times in my life, working, living in a caravan. My parents had a big country house in Devon as a guest house, but there was a business. The place which you talked about extending properties, the place I had up in London, it was a 2-bedroom maisonette built in 1889. We sold it to people, and they immediately wanted to put another roof on top of that. So all these things happen. Also, people are living longer because of improved health, improved diet, and so on. These are all parts of the problem. There's also the short-termism of government in this country. It's a perpetual problem. It's short-termism. It doesn't look 20, 30 years ahead. It's looking 5 years ahead of the next election. Last week, I've been up to Salisbury the last couple of days. I've seen vast land areas there, which were farmland, now being built on. Go up to West Farley Cross, you see the same thing there. There's land. And also, if not the building on, it's putting on blinking solar panels. And no matter what it is, whether it's houses or whether it's diamonds, but if something is rare, then the price goes up. And the rarity of accommodation, because of the rarity of land, therefore the price is going up. Unless we do what we did in Holland and extend the area of the country, you're never going to have more land to build on.
Okay, Eric, I'll let
We'll let you there. The main point you made will be developed later on, and we will see that we have a huge amount of land we can choose to build on if we want. I would make the point that the only reason we think Britain is full is because that's the bit we're allowed in. The bit we aren't allowed in is empty. With regard to most of your points, I think they're absolutely right, yes. But in terms of expectations by the young, they are now sorely being disappointed. So they may have gone up or they may have gone down, but they're certainly not being fulfilled. Now, I wonder where the devil we got to. Help to Buy schemes. I think that's a new one. Obviously, as we've said, they're for first timers with no deposit, and ostensibly that's quite a beneficial plan to have, isn't it? And they've come in since the financial crisis in various ways. Now, Help to Buy schemes generally enable particular selected people who are first-time buyers to have assistance from the government to have, say, a 20% deposit with an interest from the government in the resulting sale of the house. But after COVID, the first thing that Chancellor Sunak did was push money into the bottom of the market with a Help to Buy programme, which was completely unnecessary in that house prices would have been perfectly well supported anyway. In the event, they just stoked the market, and the resulting house prices went up more than the value of the assistance, so that was counterproductive. At the same time, it raised builders' profits, and substandard homes were hurriedly put out to meet the demand. So all in all, it was a pretty terrible policy to have, but it reinforces the view that supply is the issue, not demand. The Conservatives, if they see any flaws in the house prices going up, they stoke demand. But nobody seems to address supply. Land hoarding is another issue in the UK, which comes and goes. Approximately 6 major operators, 6 major builders now control the market and have a much higher proportion of it than they used to. There are no legal restrictions, I don't think, on holding land for as long as you like, and when interest rates are zero, it's quite easy to hang on to a land bank. Though I must say that planning permission lapses after 3 years, so there might be reasons you'd want to control that. It's been very commonplace in the last 10, 20 years for builders, apart from builders just keeping a bunch of land options in their back pocket. Supermarkets are doing this for quite a while in order to stop other supermarkets from setting up close to them. But I think that's probably become a little bit too expensive to do now. Under a regime of higher interest rates, then the cost of holding land goes up, and so this becomes a worse option. But the general conclusion is we need our land to be used and not to be left around in derelict states or underutilised. And I can say from my road in Alum Chine, there's been a handful of plots along there that have been in terrible state for 10 years. And occasionally one comes to fruition without too much competition in the road. Right, the soaring cost of land we've already spoken about. It's been brilliant if you've got some. So in the 25 years to 2016, and I'm only using these years because I haven't bothered to update my knowledge on this, land went up by 8% per annum cumulative. Now if you think about it, that's pretty good. That represents a multiple of something like 5 times, I think, in that period. Woodland was even better, about 9%. Now, woodland is mostly land, but we'll see there's a kicker, which is even better tax treatment. Gains for both these are often or are normally tax-free because you can reinvest your proceeds to avoid or defer capital gains tax. One consequence of all this reinvestment is that there's been a very thin market in English land, by which I mean that very little comes onto the market. So again, we've got a lot of potential purchasers chasing a small amount of land coming onto the market. What happens? Price goes up. It obviously seems an excellent long-term investment, and James Dyson has famously jumped in with both feet and has about 25,000 acres. The point I was making earlier, apparently over a 40-year rise, and this is again on average, land prices in the UK have gone up by, this is relative land prices, have gone up by 250% versus US and Eurozone plus 50%. The point being that our land prices have been going up faster than equivalent countries. And in saying equivalent, I recognise they have more land, which would have something to do with it, but I'm also trying to show that our land prices are going up particularly because of the underlying laws. And land taxation is one reason. Again, there's no reason we should all be tax experts, but just to give you some flavour. On woodland, which now covers an eighth of the UK, so we've been encouraging people to develop woodland, and it's been a very successful policy. But we've been encouraging them by taking no income tax, taking no capital gains tax, and taking no inheritance tax. So if you're rich enough to own and develop woodland, you're in a very nice place. You can reduce income tax by incorporating, so that you're paying corporation tax rates rather than income tax rates if you happen to be well off. There's lavish use of tax havens and trusts. So I'll give you the example of Lord Grosvenor once again. The late Duke of Westminster died some few years ago, 8 or 10, and when he died he was worth about 9.5 billion. And his son, the new Duke of Westminster, inherited 9.5 billion because the whole lot was in trust. So if you have parents who've passed away sadly and been charged with inheritance tax, you might have cause to feel, well, shall I say, pissed off. You're pausing that, are you? So bottom line, landowners are privileged. Again, there's no point in us spending too much time on taxes. Generation rent, now the point about the young and whether their expectations are met. Two dates chosen to compare here, 1991 and currently. Age 16 to 24, well that's pretty good age to get a house, isn't it? But in 1991, believe it or not, a third of people that age were. Let's look at 25 to 34, and this is cumulative. So in 1991, people of 34, two-thirds of them had their own place to live. Recently, that's fallen off to 38%. Pensioners, on the other hand, have done quite well during this period of rising prices, and the proportion of pensioners with houses has gone up during that period, which I'm very happy about and I think is a great outcome. But why does this matter? An awful lot of commentators think that failure to house young adults is a social disaster. Housing costs have risen steadily as a percentage of income from 10% in the 1940s. I remember thinking it was about 15% when I came out of university in 1970-ish, to 30 to 40% now. So the picture we're painting is that younger people are paying more and more on their rents as house prices go up and therefore rents go up. So where will they find the money to save a deposit? And can they even keep their standard of living going? And many of them are finding it very hard. Housing provision. I've taken a few liberties here. This is a very simplified picture. We've already seen in the post-war period we were able to build 300,000 a year in certain years. In the 70s, following the Compensation Act, we're already seeing the numbers starting to fall, but they're still quite healthy at 250,000 a year. 80s down again, and since 2000, they've mostly been below 200,000 a year and well below that around the financial crisis. A recent House of Lords paper concluded we need a minimum of 300,000 per annum, and I have seen more quoted in various papers. Social housing, we've already referred to. In 1969, bills by local authorities totaled about 140,000. Effectively now they're zero. I mean, we build a few thousand a year. And that source of accommodation has been destroyed by Thatcher and successive Tory policies. You may think is a good thing, you may think is a bad thing, but that is the fact. There have been promises to reinvest proceeds of right to buy sales, but they've never been actioned or they've never been practicable either due to the high land cost and lack of resource. I just want to give a shout out to Henry George. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. He's a well-known American economist from the end of the 19th century. And he spent a great deal of time talking about this area. So he was an economist, journalist and philosopher. He believed that people should own their own production. That's not particularly what we're talking about today. But he recognised how the economic value of land is captured by a small number, and his view should be shared by all. He had a very famous book called Progress and Poverty, which apparently sold in millions, which is not bad for the 19th century. And in particular, that explains the increase of want concurrent with the increase of wealth. And that's exactly what we are seeing today. Bear with me, please. I'm doing what Boris Johnson famously did.
You need to narrow that though.
I'm sorry?
You need to narrow that though.
Let us now recap on the losers and winners we have identified. There are something over 270,000 homeless in the country, including 123,000 children. And that number is multiplied by 10 in a few decades. 250,000 are in temporary accommodation, very expensively. The rest are in hostels, and about 2,400 sleep rough. That's from shelter. There's a category called beds in sheds. I don't know how many of you have come across that. This is where outbuildings are used for people to sleep in. It's illegal, but a lot of people are doing it. The other thing I've noticed is people living in vans. There's one very prominent in Alum Chine, and there have been others from time to time. But the guy I'm talking about is full-time. I mean, that's where he lives. Social housing waiting list. Over 1 million households. Can be up to 10 years to get placed. Last year didn't help. So what about tenants? They have little security. There is still no fault eviction, although the government is thinking of bringing that to an end. In the UK, we have short-term letting periods, typically 6 or 12 months, whereas people who let in Germany and other European countries expect to be there for years or for life if they choose to be. There's little enforcement of repairs and maintenance. You either have bad landlords or good landlords. Although there are laws dealing with that, they're not properly enforced. And renters often have frequent moves chasing a rent spiral when they are unable to meet whatever they are required to pay because rent's just gone up 10%. So, generation rent. Can't save deposits, often live with their parents. But there's a point for all of us here, which is that high asset prices stifle the economy. They suck money out of what would be our normal day-to-day operations. If people weren't spending a lot of money on mortgages and on rent, they'd be spending it on all the things that make the world go round instead. Now, we're going to talk about winners. I need some fortification. Well, I thought I'd put oligarchs and despots at the top. They have absolutely loved a secure rising market with privacy, lack of transparency, and a good legal system, which London provides. So London has been the money laundering capital of the world. Again, rather late on, various laws are planned to try and change that. The banks have been happy. 3/5 of their loans are backed by land and property collateral, and there's a flourishing mortgage market for them to tap into. Builders and developers are the ones who still exist, have been chuffed to bits. There are rising land prices. There's an oligopoly. That's not my word, that's the House of Lords who believe that. Limited competition. They have control over land banks which keep going up. High margins, poor regulation. Grenfell speaks for itself. Now the government, I have to say it, but the high asset prices maintain the Tory vote, and they make sure that on the whole those prices stay high. Contributions from builders, developers, the year that was quoted, I can't remember which one it was, but within the last few years was £11 million in a year. MPs are landowners and buy-to-let landlords, and you may have come across house flips whereby MPs in London who have more than one house switch from one to the other to minimise their capital gains tax liability. What about other property owners and landlords? Householders have tax-free property gains on their principal private residence. Well, that's fair enough. We all want to live in our house, don't we, without being troubled too much by the taxman. But there is a massive shift of wealth over time from the have-nots to the haves. And it's a main driver of inequality in Britain, which is becoming ludicrous. And landowners, of course, take super profits from planning gain. I don't blame them. If I were a landowner, I'd be quite happy to do that. Now, so far as I'm concerned, that defines what is called a tyranny of the majority, which is that 2/3 of the population get on with this game, which suits them very well. It's marginally corrupt, it's certainly unethical, and sadly the people at the bottom who are not able to tap in to these rising asset prices are left to trail. Forgive me, you'd think I'd be able to manage 4 sheets of paper, wouldn't you, without getting into too much trouble? Let's surprise me and move on. Everything is wrong. I hesitated before heading up a slide, everything is wrong. But as far as I'm concerned, if you think about the outcomes that you would like a well-ordered society to have, most of the major policies that have been put in place since the 1961 Act, in my view, have been counterproductive. We need multifaceted solutions. We need to challenge vested interests, because if we do not, the same circumstances will continue. Liam Halligan certainly foresees an increased role of government, and I would like that as well. We need to focus on supply, as we've seen, rather than demand. Demand looks after itself. In fact, somewhere I've quoted we're 3 million houses short. More recent estimates I've seen are 4 million and even above that. Britain is not full, and I'll put up an illustration of that point to deal with this gentleman's argument in a moment. The solutions can seem
How would it look if it were full?
I'm sorry?
How would it look if it were full? We'd be concreted all over.
There would be a much higher proportion of concrete. The bit that we're allowed in is full. You remember at the beginning I referred to the 8% that people are allowed into. And then there's bits that are uninhabitable and a few lakes and stuff like that. The rest of it's open farmland. That's great, but I think we have a duty to house our people, that's all. I'm just acknowledging here at the bottom that the housing market is very difficult. It isn't simple. A lot of ducks have to be in a row before you can build houses. Now, after all this criticism, I have to say some high-ranking Tories are very sympathetic to these views, but the government as a whole won't touch any serious change to what is going on, in my view. The point about Britain being not full. 90% or possibly 89% is deemed to be not developed in any way at all.
90% of what?
Of the land.
Of the UK?
Yep.
Including mountains, yeah.
Yeah, including mountains and empty fields.
Yeah, including farmland?
Well, no, most of that is farmland. A lot of that is farmland. A lot of that... But it means not roads and airports and houses and warehouses and things. It means not concrete. We'll come to a little more illustration. Greenbelt has grown enormously to 12.6%, which is an eighth of our land value, and we've got a separate slide on Greenbelt. Now, domestic gardens and houses are deemed to cover 1.2% of the land area in England. Now, I have my doubts because I've tried to rationalise that with the number of acres. But that is certainly the number that Guy Shrubsole uses, and he's been working on this for a lot longer than me, so maybe I have to think about that. Obviously, there's some area attributed to commercial land, and 6% is state-owned. More availability derived from this requires political will, new policies, and, in my opinion, compulsory purchase at existing use prices. But that will be highly controversial, and we'll come to that. Now, this is an interesting one, so I may have to eat my shorts having put this up. And I put up the planning permission is not a barrier. Now, for a lot of the last few decades, it has been quoted as a barrier, although it's a favourite excuse of politicians and landowners to say, oh, well, it's the planning rules. But if we look at the reason for me putting that up, in 2010, only 156,000 units were approved, and there was an average completion period of 1.7 years. Well, that's not feeding us 300,000 houses, is it? Over the 2010s, and the date selected from the book was 2015, the Conservatives have put in something called the National Planning Policy Framework, which looks to me from an amateur scan to be very valuable stuff. But unfortunately, it doesn't look as if it's going to be working. But in 2017, for example, 370,000 units were approved for building, although the average build-out period had now gone to 4 years. If we come to the end of the 2020s, in that decade, we had built up an additional 1 million planning permits that were unfilled. So as we come into the 20s and into COVID, builders are sitting on 1 million planning permits and then expecting to take an average of 4 years to build them out. So in that situation, we're quite well placed. Now, there's obviously been a downturn due to higher interest rates, so fewer people are wanting to build stuff because it costs more to build them, and they might not sell. But the thing that changed this morning, which Barry pointed out to me, was an article in the Times, which some of you may have seen, which is that a fair number of local councils are rejecting their plans, and in consequence the government has cancelled them for the time being. So the pressure's off, and we won't be getting our houses until they've sorted out another way of dealing with it. Moving on. We've spoken about needing supply, not demand. I've already explained, from my point of view, the implementation of right to buy was iniquitous and political. Help to buy, which is Osborne's and Sunak's plans, have fueled price rises and lowered quality. So we need a different HTB, which is help to build. And that will involve increasing competition, support for SMEs, which in turn will require new financing and guarantees because they tend not to be able to fund their own operations until they actually sell stuff. We need to control land hoarding. And one suggestion from Halligan is that planning permission should be a time-limited contract. So when you agree what you're going to build with the local authority, then maybe you agree a period like 2 years, and if either side prevaricates or prevents that from happening, then maybe they can be taken to court. So there's now some discipline around that.
Does that period include completion? Because that's how I understood it. 3 years, right?
3 years is what you are allowed at the moment.
Start building.
That's right. So at the moment, it's you can hold on to land or generally take as long as you want to complete, because even if your planning permission runs out, you can apply for it again.
Yeah, so you just lay a few bricks at the end of the 3 years, then you've got forever.
Yeah. So we're saying that's one of the things we wish to resolve, because we want houses to come to market, not to sit in builders' back pockets. And you could easily resolve this with penalties such as interest rate or council tax. I mean, it really is not a problem to do that. We probably want to favour local rather than overseas purchase. There's a modest disadvantage for overseas buyers, but it certainly doesn't stop anybody as far as I can see. But in addition to this, we need more fundamental change. Let's have a quick run through some other countries, and the point here is to see that it can be done differently. The way that Britain does it is not the way that everybody does it all over the world, rather the contrary. So I've used a couple of specific examples, and the examples themselves may not be right bang up to date, but they just give a flavour. So Singapore is widely seen as a capitalist success. The government is the main landowner, which may surprise some people. I gather they own about 90% of the land. Foreign ownership is controlled, so in some way they cease too much foreign takeover of land, although I understand Chinese demand has soared recently, so maybe that's been relaxed, I really couldn't say. The government allocates land via long-term leases and collects rent, and where necessary there's compulsory purchase of private land. So there's an example where some of the things I'm talking about, which will outrage right-wing thinkers in this country, which are actually associated with a great capitalist success. The other example is South Korea. The state and the Korean bank own 50% of the land. They very actively manage this land in the general interest, and one consequence is that land prices have gone up slower than incomes, so people are better able to buy a better standard of living as opposed to we who are less able to. And then generally referring to other European countries, and I'm thinking particularly of Germany and Holland, there are various means of capturing the planning gain so that you can feed that back into local infrastructure. So Halligan envisages a major government role. The first step would be scrap the 1961 Land Compensation Act. He envisages land purchases backed by compulsory purchase powers at existing use value. Now, this is part me and part Halligan, but I think the balance of power needs to completely shift. At the moment, developers have control of plots, and they then negotiate with councils in various ways before they're allowed to build. If the plots pass through the state, then the state can ask for competitive tenders, and that will encourage small and medium enterprises, and it will encourage a better outcome for the public. Because at the moment, as we've seen, there's effectively an oligopoly dealing with that. And in the good times, the margins that the builders achieve are extremely high. There are various sources for land to housing associations and local authorities at fair prices, and we'll come to the green belt, but Halligan also mentions public land banks, which are currently about 6%. And I've slightly confused myself here, because he also recommends planning a scheme like Germany where uplift is gathered on a 50-50 basis. And to be honest, I think that is more realistic rather than compulsory purchase. What I can say is perfectly obvious. is that if some land is sold on a 50% uplift and some is sold on a 0% uplift, then there will be blood in the streets. But just to put all this into perspective, I am reliant on my books, but I'm told that the land cost of Milton Keynes was only 1% of the overall development cost, when effectively they will have acquired that at agricultural land values. If you try to do it today, it's going to be up in the 60s or 70s. Well, blow me down. I hadn't expected to get there. I'll tell you what, as time is pressing, I will just read my conclusions. Capitalism can work for the common good when it is allowed to, and it can help us broadly create and distribute wealth. In many ways, Halligan's proposed solutions take us back to the two post-war periods, when sweeping plans used government purchasing power and general political will to achieve great things. Those wishing to retain the status quo will say that such plans are too socialistic and the market always knows best. We have seen that a market based on unearned income and oligopoly profit leads to a completely dysfunctional outcome which does not meet our housing and social needs. Most commentators, the House of Lords, and even some grandees in the current government recognise this. With 1 million households on waiting lists and an overall shortfall of at least 3 million units, we can reasonably say that we have a post-war scale problem. So I agree with Halligan, we need a post-war scale solution, and a return to these government powers, broadly speaking, is fully justified. There are many aspects we have not had time to address, but I hope we may cover some of these in the discussion. Probably a good time for me to stop.